So there was an era in American politics between the mid-80s, arguably to the mid-90s, known as the tough-on-crime era, where pretty much politicians in both parties each tried to convince the American people that they were more tough on crime than everyone else. Now, what resulted from supposedly tough on crime pushes was an explosion in the prison population. Now, a lot of this is credited to the 1994 crime bill. And during that time, you can go back and watch a lot of the House and Senate floor debates, and politicians were all talking about how horrible crime was and trying to fearmonger and that we have to take bold action, and not just that, we have to be especially harsh. Now, the crime bill didn't pass until 1994, but in 1991, it actually was first introduced, and it ultimately died when the Senate and the House versions couldn't be reconciled. But Joe Biden was talking about just how tough on crime he was back then in 1991, and here's what he said about that, because I want to show you an example of just how harsh and really barbaric this rhetoric was.
The president's death penalty proposals, and I might add, Biden crime bill is before us, calls for the death penalty for 51 offenses. A wag in the newspaper recently wrote that something to the effect that Biden has made it a death penalty offense for everything but jaywalking.
I mean, I think that clip speaks for itself. Quote, Biden has made it a death penalty offense for everything but jaywalking. That wasn't something that he was condemning. In that context, he was bragging about this. Now, Joe Biden has recently kind of done a 180, and all of a sudden, he's saying, maybe I haven't always been right about this particular issue, but he was defending this bill, the specifically 1994 crime bill, all the way up until 2016. Now, when we go to 1993, which is when he was talking about the bill that actually was codified into law by Bill Clinton, well, what he says here is also very problematic, because listen to what he says. You're going to find a lot of dog whistles here and racially coded language as he speaks about the need for this crime bill.
Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple, pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
Obviously, what he was referring to there was super predators. Now, he didn't say the words super predator, but he was using racially coded language to prime you into thinking about super predators. And super predators, like it or not, people don't like to admit this in the Democratic Party, but this is a racist word used to describe black youth, and it was dehumanizing. It was called super predators because this group of youth pose a unique threat in that they lack empathy and they're different than the others. It was dehumanizing. It was disgusting. Now, as Joe Biden and others made the pitch for the 1994 crime bill, they got what they wanted. And the result of that, as you will see now with this statistic, is an explosion in the prison population. Now, it was already going up before 1994, but this just exacerbated a problem that already persisted in the United States. And you can argue that it dated back to the Nixon era with the war on drugs, but got really bad, during the Reagan era. And then it just all came to a head with the passage of the 1994 crime bill. But there was one individual who was actually talking about the 1994 crime bill in a really clear-headed way, and that person is Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders is someone who actually did go on to begrudgingly vote for the 1994 crime bill, so you can say that he's also culpable here, and I think that that would probably be fair, and I think he takes responsibility for that, but you have to acknowledge that when he says he voted for the crime bill, he voted for it specifically because he was very heavily in favor of one provision of that, of violence against women provision. So you have to understand that there's a lot of bills that have a name, and then there are other bills attached to it. And this is specifically so you can get other people to support your legislation that they wouldn't otherwise be inclined to support. Because had the crime bill not included the violence against women provision, Bernie Sanders undoubtedly would have voted against it because he was warning about the crime bill and what could possibly come to fruition as a result of this if we take this tough-on-stance approach. And here's what he had to say back then.
Mr. Chairman, how do we talk about the very serious crime problem in America without mentioning that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world by far, with 22% of our children in poverty and 5 million kids hungry today? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? How do we talk about crime when this Congress is prepared this year to spend 11 times more for the military than for education? When 21% of our kids drop out of high school, when a recent study told us that twice as many young workers now earn poverty wages as 10 years ago, when the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider, and when the rate of poverty continues to grow? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? Mr. Chairman, it is my firm belief that clearly there are people in our society who are horribly violent, who are deeply sick and sociopathic, and clearly these people must be put behind bars in order to protect society from them. But it is also my view that through the neglect of our government and through a grossly irrational set of priorities, we are dooming today tens of millions of young people to a future of bitterness, misery, hopelessness, drugs, crime, and violence. And, Mr. Speaker, all the jails in the world, and we already imprison more people per capita than any other country, and all of the executions. Can I ask for one more moment, please?
I give the gentleman 30 seconds. We'll run.
All the jails in the world and all the executions in the world will not make that situation right. We can either educate or electrocute. We can create meaningful jobs, rebuilding our society, or we can build more jails. Mr. Speaker, let us create a society of hope and compassion, not one of hate and vengeance.
So what he did there was incredibly important because it showed that he had the foresight that everyone else in Congress lacked. He said, look, we're adopting this punishment mentality, but we're not actually examining the underlying causal factors that lead to crime in the first place. We're not looking at addressing poverty. We're not looking at actually targeting the things that would reduce poverty overall because everyone was so hell-bent on just punishing. And what Bernie Sanders warned about was that this would lead to a society where we are prioritizing punishment over solving the problem we all claim to care so much about. We shouldn't be building more jails, we should be building more schools. And that was the overall message. And when you look back today, after seeing the results of what the 1994 crime bill did, it's easy to see that Bernie Sanders was correct. Now, the tough on crime era ended certainly by the 2010s, but not everyone let off of this tough on crime mentality. Another 2020 presidential candidate still couldn't really let go and kind of made fun of the sentiment that Bernie Sanders expressed back in the 1990s when he said, look, we should be building schools, not jails. We should be taking care of people who are more likely to commit crimes, not punish them. But there were some politicians in the 2010s that still made fun of that stance.
Okay, so I say with all love and warmth that part of the concern also for people who are progressive thinking and liberal-minded, or just progressive thinking in terms of just fix it, is that we all have these posters in our closet that is attached to a stick that we sometimes will card out when we're talking about criminal justice policy and those statistics that you first heard when we opened it up, incarceration. And we run around with these signs, build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. And we walk around everywhere. Build more schools. We protest. Build more schools, less jails. Put money into education, not prisons. There's a fundamental problem with that approach, in my opinion. And it's this. I agree with that conceptually. But you have not addressed the reason I have 3 padlocks on my front door.
Bernie Sanders is the only one that turned out to be right. And it's not the only issue that Bernie Sanders was ahead of everyone else on. Now, the reason why I am spotlighting these 3 individuals in particular is because they're largely viewed as the 2020 presidential frontrunners. So it's important to look at this issue and acknowledge who was best about this and who was saying the same thing since the 1990s. And clearly, that individual was Bernie Sanders.
Mike is a total loser, so don't hit the subscribe button, okay? And whatever you do, folks, do not hit the notification bell either. Mike treats me so unfairly.